So your name is Neils?
Yeah, Neils Agather.
Neils Agather, and you're going to tell us a little bit of story about FIFI.
Happy to do it.
Okay, I'm ready.
So my father, Victor Agather, he was in the Ready Reserves in the 1930s and got called to active duty in August of 1940 and was assigned to the B-29 program, which at that point was sort of really in its early development stages. Eddie Allen, for example, was still alive at the time. Airplane had not flown. And my dad stuck with the program all the way through to 1945. So he was there through the early development, all the problems that they had with it, the crashes that they had with it, the engine fires that they had with it. This airplane was not, what they did was they put it into production knowing it had flaws. And so they designed kits. So they would, depending on where the airplane was in its assembly process, they would fix it. You know, they would add the newly repaired item to it as it went down the line,
Gotcha.
or they would add the kit later. That became a problem because in the winter of 43, 44, the airplanes showed up in Kansas, Olathe, Pratt, places like that. Airplanes would come in, crews would come in from somewhere else. Some of them had never seen a B-29 or had barely been trained in one. Mechanics had been trained and never seen one either. And then these kits showed up, and they had to modify them before they could send them to war. And that was a real mess because, as you can imagine, some airplanes had some things, others didn't. And the kits would show up and they were not in any kind of an order. But anyway, they got it all done. And then they shipped off to China, Burma, India. This was before the Marines had taken Saipan and Tinian, which were taken only for use as B-29 bases. That was the only purpose for taking those islands.
Right.
So my father stuck with them all the way through there, and then went to the Marianas with them all the way through there. The war comes to an end. He decides he's done. He doesn't want anything to do with B-29s again. Worn out, 5 years of B-29s. However, in 1960 or so, he joins up with the then Confederate Air Force, and they were building a collection. And he told them, well, it won't be complete unless you have a B-29. So they went searching for a B-29, and there were really none to be had. They were either guard posts, which you couldn't get. They were in museums, Nola Gay, Boxcar, things like that, you couldn't get. And then there were some at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, they're in Maryland, basically on the ocean. They were in terrible shape. They were shot at and corroded. I mean, today, when you build airplanes like this Zero out of corroded parts, maybe today you would do it. But in those days, they were really looking for something that was fairly complete. And then out of sheer luck, so there's essentially none to be had. Out of sheer luck, a guy happened to be flying over China Lake, California, the Naval Weapons Depot Center there. It's basically desert, and they found a small group of B-29s there that were not on any Air Force inventory. And so my dad had some contacts in the Air Force because he maintained his ties. He was in the reserves all the way through, and so he was able to they found them. The fact that the Air Force owned them, which they were, and they got one donated, and they gave him permission to fly it out. And so my dad and a group of guys went in and picked this airplane out of all the bunch in China Lake, and scavenged for extra props, engines, extra set of landing gears, everything. So I put the airplane together. It had sat in the desert for 17 years, and 6 weeks later it flew out.
Wow.
Flew to Texas. Then, sat on the ground because it had this no-fly clause, and my dad spent the next 3 years removing the no-fly clause. And what he finally did, he basically ran into walls everywhere. Nobody wanted him to do this, and he went to Barry Goldwater. My dad didn't know Barry Goldwater, but he was head of the Armed Services Committee, a very powerful man, and a guy that today would know he'd be a Tea Party guy. He really hates big government.
Yeah.
And my dad sat down, patiently waited until finally Barry Goldwater would see him, and he explained what he was trying to do. And Barry Goldwater, it really upset him that basically here's a group of individuals trying to preserve history, especially in Barry's case, Air Force history. Barry was an Air Force guy. And made one phone call, and the no-fly clause was removed. Then the issue came up, so now we're flying the airplane. Well, how are we going to afford to fly it? And my dad said, well, maybe we can take it on the road. So FIFI was the first airplane to hit the road, sell cockpit tours, hats, T-shirts, and so on. And that's how we've been doing it for 40 years.
Now tell us about the name.
So my dad's thought, I don't know why he wanted this, but he wanted Thumper. For some reason, he had an attachment. He knew, he wasn't with any one squadron, because he took care of all the airplanes that were there. So I have photographs, nose art that he took of all these different airplanes. But for some reason, Thumper was the one he wanted, and that's what he thought of painting on there. But the commemorative Air Force crews who were working on the airplane surprised him one day by painting FIFI on the side. It was named after my mother.
Your mom.
Yep.
Okay.
And the A on the tail they put on in honor of him, Agather.
So last name.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I appreciate it.